Before we go on to this afternoon's topic, any questions from the discussion group anyone would like to bring up?
We could not clarify the difference between nirvana and enlightenment.
The difference between nirvana and enlightenment, we briefly mentioned that the other day, and we'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. So remember, nirvana is the goal of liberation from samsara, and to achieve that we have to eliminate the mental afflictions, or another word for that is the afflictive obscurations. So the afflictive obscurations are what obscures us from achieving nirvana, and so that is the mental affliction, specifically this fundamental ignorance. To go on to achieve enlightenment, we also have to get rid of these what's called cognitive obscurations. So remember those subtle stains in our mind that cause this mistaken dualistic appearance. So we have to eliminate that, which is harder than just the mental afflictions. So that's the next step we need to get rid of to move on to enlightenment. So that's the difference.
Just a clarification question. So you mentioned the fundamental ignorance for nirvana and the mistaken dualistic idea for enlightenment. Are these two different?
Depends who you talk to. What we've seen in this three vehicles chart is that in the Theravada, the Vipassana, at the deepest level is this no self. And so it's this grasping to false sense of self that is what we really need to eliminate to achieve nirvana. But of course the big question is, what do we mean by self? Because we can grasp onto a false sense of me in a number of levels. And we'll look at that tomorrow. And in the Mahayana, this false grasping to self at the deepest level is this grasping onto independent me and therefore independent world. So at that level, then, the mistaken dualistic appearance is related to that. But more will come tomorrow morning.
You couldn't find the answer to the third question. It was why are the six perfections in the order to that?
Did anyone come up with any ideas or answers as to why the six perfections are in that order? There's at least two reasons. Probably more, but at least two.
Each one,
Behind Linda.
each one is linked to the other, like
Linked? What do you mean linked?
Once you practice generosity, you get a little more ethical. Once you meditate ethical, you come into patience. You get more patient.
Excellent. Very good. Yeah, that's one answer exactly. Is that the more we practice generosity, the easier it is to be ethical. The more ethical we are, the easier it is to be patient. The more patient we are, the easier it is to have joyous effort. The more joyous effort, easier concentration. More concentration, the easier wisdom. That's one. The other one? Anyone else? Another reason?
Gross separate.
In what sense?
Gross, gross. We spoke about gross mind, subtle mind.
Yeah, not in that sense, but I think you're very close. Yeah. Generosity is easier than ethics. It goes from easier to more difficult. So there are probably more reasons, but they're the two I remember when I studied this.
You did figure it out that it is because of that, but why? How does generosity lead to ethics?
Well, because if you are more generous, then it'll be easier to be ethical.
How?
Because if you're not generous, then you may actually want to get things from people, which is stealing, which means you'll be unethical. So if you're being generous, that means it'll be easier to be ethical with respect to others because you're giving instead of maybe trying to take. No, I'm not saying the same thing. I'm just saying if you are generous, it's easier to be ethical. Can you be ethical without being generous? Probably.
So then generosity doesn't precede ethics, right?
Well, it precedes it in the sense it's easier, and also if we practice generosity, you'll find it's easier to be ethical in that sense. But of course, here with these 6 perfections, it's recommended we practice all 6 together in everything. So, like if we're being generous, then make sure we're ethical when we're being generous, and be patient in giving, because sometimes we need to be patient, and do it joyfully with a focused mind, and of course use wisdom when we're being generous. So we practice all 6 together with whatever we're doing. It's not like we start with generosity and say, okay, we won't do any of that other stuff until I get generous, then I'll try ethics. No, it's just that they sort of a natural order there.
We were not clear about what ethics mean according to Buddhism. So we have different ideas of what ethics. So what does ethics mean according to Buddhism?
So the other day we talked about the 10 virtues. Normally that's presented as the giving up the 10 non-virtues. So in the foundation level there, we saw that ethics is really just avoiding harmful behaviour. That's sort of the baseline. But here in the Mahayana, in the 6 perfections, ethics was that plus the ethics of doing virtuous actions and the ethics of helping others. So it's much more sort of proactive. So there are many levels we can practice ethics, but the sort of the minimum level would be to avoid harmful behaviour. I think the Dalai Lama often says, try to help others, and if you can't, at least don't harm them.
So these virtues can also come into conflict with each other sometimes.
Sorry? I didn't catch something about virtues.
The virtues can also come in conflict with each other.
Example?
So, like being honest can kill someone.
Yeah, but remember, with all of these virtues, you have to apply wisdom and compassion, otherwise it's not a virtue. Just telling the truth, you could do that wishing to harm someone, then it's not a virtue. Yeah? So we need to keep this in mind.
What is the...
Wait. Behind. Yeah, right at the back, yeah.
Okay. So one of the things we were discussing is that maybe concentration is also a little bit further, because you need to have a base on what to concentrate on, whether to concentrate, otherwise you'll be concentrated in like bad things. I don't know, on the 6 perfections.
Oh, I see what you mean, that it comes after because we need to make sure we have all those other things first.
Yeah, I don't know.
And as well, also, that's a point there, but also these are called the 6 perfections. So what makes generosity a perfection is if we have bodhicitta. So we're not talking about just generosity in general here, we're talking about generosity motivated by bodhicitta, and ethics motivated by bodhicitta. That's why they're called perfections, is because all of these practices are done with a bodhicitta motivation, and what bodhicitta is, that's the topic for this afternoon. Behind.
So
Then you're next.
With question number 1, is developing renunciation. Are there levels to that? I mean, in regards to if you become a monk or a nun, it might be easier to uphold the renunciation or this wish because you're in an environment that supports your practices.
Right.
You don't own as much. So, like when we go back home and, like I said, we have this renunciation, how do we develop that really for? And at what level? I mean, if our goal is enlightenment, we have to achieve that.
So remember, renunciation is really, it's a bad translation actually. It's not about giving up money and things. It's about the wish to be free of suffering. It's the wish for liberation from suffering. So whether we're a monk or a nun or whatever situation we find ourselves in, we can develop that wish. And actually we saw earlier in the course that one of the things that can be helpful to develop that is if we are suffering. Because if life's going along quite well, it might be difficult to develop that because, life's pretty good. I've got a good job, I enjoy things, blah, 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 blah. may be difficult actually to develop renunciation with that lifestyle. But again, it doesn't, it's not like different levels in terms of if you're a monk or a nun again, it may be more difficult to sustain that if you're in an environment that's pulling you in a different direction. Yes, true. But I think we can cultivate that no matter what type of person we are. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on the last morning in terms of what sort of supportive environment, and also we're going to talk about that tomorrow, day after tomorrow, also more about supportive environment for that. So that's still to come a little bit.
I have a question about being honest.
Mm-hmm.
If someone asks a question to me,
Mm-hmm.
and if I just keep silent, am I honest?
If you are trying to deceive them, no.
I think that's a koan.
Hmm?
I think that's a koan.
So, like in Buddha.
So again, honesty is about non-deception. And by you being silent, if they interpret that in a certain way and you intended to deceive them, that's being dishonest in being silent.
And also Buddha teaches different methods to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And one example is a house is on fire and two boys are playing inside the house. Father asks them come out. They are so so into the play, did not hear their father. And the father changed the idea, shouting to them, I have new toys, come out, come out. And he saved the life for the two boys, but he lied to the boys. Is he honest?
So here we have to be very careful because often, people say, well, yeah, but I told a lie with a good motivation, so-called white lies. Okay, but maybe tomorrow it's not going to be so white because we're still deceiving. So the bottom line is that it's, if possible, depending on situation, not to start going that way. Because yes, today maybe we're telling a lie with a good motivation, but tomorrow maybe it's not so good, and then eventually, because we develop the habit of deceiving.
Right.
So we have to be very careful about that, because we'll end up starting to go in a certain direction. So that's again, so we have to use wisdom in terms of how we respond to people and what we say to them.
Say you're the father, so after he saved the boys and apologized to them for telling the lie.
Sorry, what's that?
Say after the father saved the two boys' life,
Right.
and he apologized to the boys for telling them a lie.
Right, okay.
Should be that like a better situation?
I mean, you can explain why he did it to help them,
Right.
so that they don't get the idea that they can start telling lies.
Right.
Why for Theravada the goal is not enlightenment?
Okay.
Instead of Nirvana?
So this all has to do with, and it's a little bit beyond this course, but just briefly, is that I briefly mentioned earlier that the Buddha taught according to people's capacities, and so from that we have these different philosophical systems evolving in India, and the philosophical system that sort of underpins the Theravada is basically saying that there was only one person in the history of this earth that had the ability to achieve enlightenment, and that was Prince Siddhartha. The rest of us, he was someone special. The rest of us, we can achieve nirvana, but that's too much for us. And also, part of the philosophical system that underpins this is that when we actually achieve nirvana, and then at the end of this life, this body finishes, then never come back again, ever. So, therefore, it wouldn't even entertain. I mean, one, we can't do it, and two, when we achieve nirvana, then that's end of story anyway. So, That's the philosophical system that they are based on. But of course we have to distinguish between philosophical system and actually what the practitioner realises. Because what we're going to see tomorrow in terms of this no self, the idea of no self there is different than in the Mahayana. But that doesn't mean that they end up realising two different things. It just means that if the philosophical system we're following, if it's not really the deepest understanding, we will sort of transcend that and we'll get to the final solution. So it doesn't mean that people following Theravada tradition will never achieve enlightenment. No, absolutely not. In fact, the assertion is in the Mahayana that everyone can do. It's just in terms of the philosophical system that they begin their practice with, that's all. Okay, so let's go to this afternoon's topic. So this morning we said that we can talk about the two main wings of practice, of wisdom and compassion. And that's important to practice both of these wings, that if we only do one or the other, we're going to get ourselves into trouble, we're going to deviate and find ourselves in difficulty. And that we saw at the foundation level that the wisdom wing were these three marks of existence, which we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow morning. And the compassion wing were these four immeasurables that we talked about this morning. And then in the Mahayana, which builds on that foundation, what we're going to see tomorrow is that in the wisdom wing, then they build on the three marks of existence with this wisdom of emptiness. So that's going to be one of the main topics, the main topic for tomorrow. And then on the compassion wing, building on top of the four immeasurables with this what's called Bodhicitta. So just before we go to the Bodhicitta explanation, just to review these four immeasurables. So these are, in the Theravada tradition, they're often called the four Brahma Viharas. And here, these are four qualities we are cultivating towards all living beings. So the first of those, of course, was loving kindness, Maitri in Sanskrit, Metta in Pali. And again, this was the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Compassion, Karuna in Sanskrit and Pali, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So what we saw there was that both loving kindness and compassion are not emotions, they are an aspiration or a wish. And that we are to cultivate these in these stages, that particularly in our modern world, we start by cultivating loving kindness and compassion for ourselves first, then expand that out to people close to us, friends, it's easy, then slowly to strangers, difficult people, and then all living beings. And the third of the four immeasurables was empathetic joy. Again, this is focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others, and this is something very important in our modern world, where we have so much focus on the negative, and particularly with cognitive fusion. So to really have a very balanced view of ourselves and others, it's important to practice this empathetic joy, this rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. And then the last of the four qualities was this equanimity, this impartial, unbiased attitude towards others, to really overcome this bias that we have of having attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, and aversion to difficult people. To really have this sense of closeness to everyone, understanding that we're all stuck in the same situation, we're all wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. And it's this equanimity that allows us to cultivate the other three qualities out to all living beings. So this is the foundation, and this is the compassion wing of practice at Theravada. In Theravada, these are often called the four Brahma Viharas. And so on that basis then, we build on that in the Mahayana in terms of this Bodhicitta. So of course bodhicitta is a Sanskrit term. Bodhi is enlightenment and chitta is mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. And it's the mind which aspires to enlightenment for the benefit of others. And so we saw in the four immeasurables at the foundation level that actually when it really comes to compassion for ourselves, this is really renunciation, the wish for ourselves to be free of suffering and its causes. So that is actually renunciation. So bodhicitta is on the basis of renunciation. Because when we cultivate this renunciation or this wish to be liberated from suffering, then we can understand, well, I'm not the only one stuck in this cycle of existence called samsara. Everyone else is in the same situation. So then we can expand that motivation and then say, well, I'd like to also then help to liberate everyone else from suffering as well. But then, of course, if we have that aspiration, we can understand, well, in my current situation, I can't really help others very much. I've got my own issues to deal with. How can I be most effective in helping others is if I achieve full awakening, fully purify my mind, fully develop my positive qualities, then I can really be of benefit to others. And so that is bodhicitta, is that aspiration, is the aspiration for enlightenment so that we can benefit others, so that we can help to liberate everyone else from suffering. So that is bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is really two aspirations. It's the aspiration for ourselves to achieve enlightenment, and it's the aspiration to help liberate everyone else from suffering. How do we cultivate this? In the meditation text, historically in India and Tibet, there were two main techniques that were taught. The first of those was called the 7 cause and effect method. This was the one that was most widely taught because the second method was actually considered too difficult for the average person. So the second one is sometimes called the secret method. But I think in the modern world, the second method often can be the more appropriate method, and will become fairly obvious why shortly. And actually the first method in the modern world may be problematic, could be problematic for two reasons. And both of those reasons come in the very first point. The first of the 7 points is to see everyone as our mother. Of course, the logic behind this is that in this life, we've got a mother. In a previous life, we had a mother, and we keep going back. And using that logic, we can understand everyone has been our mother at some point. But of course, if we don't believe in rebirth, that logic breaks down. So that's one possible difficulty with this in the modern world. And second, of course, is the reason we would do this historically is that the mother was the person who benefited us most in our life. Carried us in the womb, gave birth to us, looked after us as a baby, fed us, clothed us, and probably even helped educate us. So the mother was historically the person who benefited us most in our life. But in the modern world, of course, many people have issues with their mother, so if we start seeing everyone as their mother, we might start hating everyone. So then the text says, well, you can replace mother with father, brother, sister. So the idea here, of course, is to get a sense of closeness to everyone, that everyone has benefited us at some point. So from that, the second step would be then to remember their kindness. To really reflect on in how many ways Mother Sentient Beings have been kind to us. And if we do that, that will lead to the third step, and that is then to develop this wish to repay their kindness. And then if we really cultivate this wish to repay their kindness, that will lead to step 4 and 5. Which is great loving kindness and great compassion. So when we see this word great here, so remember, loving kindness is the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness causes, and compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So we develop that wish, that aspiration. But when we see the word great in front, it's a little bit more than just the wish. It's also doing whatever we can to place Mother Sentient Beings in happiness and freedom from suffering. So it's a much more proactive than merely having that wish, that we would be doing whatever we could to place Mother Sentient Beings in happiness and freedom from suffering. And so if we have this great loving kindness and great compassion, then we can take that to another level. Which is the sixth step, called altruistic intention, where on the basis of great loving kindness and great compassion, then we take it to another level and we say, I am going to make it my personal responsibility to help liberate all Mother Sentient Beings from suffering. I myself alone am going to do that. I'm going to make it my personal responsibility to do that. So that's taking it to another level. But then, of course, if we cultivate this altruistic intention, then again we can look at our current situation and go, well, how can I do that? I've got very little capacity, I've got mental afflictions, I'm suffering. So how can I effectively begin to do that? Is if I achieve full awakening, if I achieve enlightenment, I can really be effective in doing that. So that would be step 7 of is Bodhicitta. So this is the 7 cause and effect method, the one that was most widely taught in ancient India and Tibet. Any questions about that before I move to the second technique? Yeah.
Just repay, can you, just because of English.
Oh, okay. The whole lot?
Just what does mean repay?
To repay means to do something in return.
Okay.
You know, they've done a lot for us. What can I do in return to help them?
So the power of way, as opposed
Power of...
the power of we, as opposed to the power of I. Is
Oh,
much
we.
greater than I. So therefore, isn't number 6 a little bit egocentric to think that you and you alone are going to liberate everyone without the help of other people?
Well, here we're talking about, of course, we can't liberate anyone. I mean, the Buddha couldn't liberate a single person. All we can do is help to liberate. So we're just saying that it's not like an ego trip that, you know, I'm going to liberate everyone. I mean, no one can liberate anyone. The only person that can liberate you is yourself. No one else can liberate you. The Buddha can't wave a magic wand and liberate you. So this is not, we're not saying we're going to liberate everyone. That would be a bit sort of, yeah, a bit odd.
But it's not referring to like I, it's more we will do our best to help people be liberated.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're just saying that we're going to make it our responsibility. That's what we're going to do, is we're going to help to liberate every single sentient being from suffering.
I thought the reason to achieve enlightenment is to avoid suffering.
Sorry, say again?
The reason to achieve enlightenment is to avoid suffering, meaning more suffering.
Well, here, if the reason to achieve enlightenment is so that we can effectively help to liberate others from suffering.
So which one is it? Is that a difference between Bodhicitta and Nirvana?
So in Nirvana, the aspiration is to liberate ourselves from suffering. And of course, we're not saying, you know, sometimes when people see that and we look at this chart here that we were looking at, the 3 vehicles chart, then people go, oh, those Theravada people, they're really selfish, aren't they? Just looking out for themselves. Not true. That's a complete misunderstanding. There's no way you're going to get anywhere near Nirvana with a selfish motivation. So remember, in Theravada, the compassion wing is loving kindness and compassion to all living beings. Without that, you're not going to get anywhere near Nirvana. And of course, when we're striving for Nirvana, we're helping others as much as we can. It's not like, oh, we just wish them well and see you later, I'll do my thing. No, we're helping them as much as we can. But here, we're taking it to another level. So therefore, in Bodhicitta, the whole purpose of not just going for Nirvana, but to achieve enlightenment, is so that we can effectively help to liberate others from suffering. In fact, here in the Mahayana vehicle, we can talk about 2 extremes. One extreme is samsara, because we don't want to be there because we're suffering. But in Mahayana, the other extreme is nirvana. Because if we end up in nirvana, you can sort of hang out in that state of peace for a long time.
Wouldn't this certain part like flip you out of nirvana or something like that?
So again, in the Theravada, once you get into the nirvana, like this life finishes, and they're in that state, they just stay. The assertion, the philosophical assertion is that you stay there forever. Mahayana says no, it's a temporary state. So you'd hang out there for a long, long, long time. And eventually you pop out of it and go, you realise it's not the end of the journey. But then, of course, the whole time you're in that state, you're not helping anyone because you're in a solitary state of peace. So from a bodhisattva perspective, that's not a good place to hang out because you can't help anyone there. And you're stuck there for like a long, long, long time.
Is it the step that Bodhisattva has to pass through on the way to enlightenment?
But again, because their motivation is bodhicitta, if Bodhisattva on the way will achieve nirvana, but then they won't just get stuck there and hang out there because if your motivation is that's your goal, you will get stuck there and hang out. But if your motivation is not that, if your motivation is bodhicitta, you'll just really just pass straight through it.
How can we imagine that state of nirvana? Like, do you take on some sort of subtle body, or like how?
Right. So again, it depends who you talk to. But if we just stay within the Mahayana, of course, if we're here now, we're meditating and we realise this no self and eliminate all the mental afflictions and we achieve nirvana, does anything happen to our body? Does it turn into light? Do we disappear somewhere? No, nothing. Same body. But our mind now is completely purified of mental afflictions, so therefore no more suffering. Can we have pain? If someone breaks our arm, will there be pain? Sure. Will we suffer? No, not one bit of suffering. at all. And then of course we're in nirvana, which means we have no mental affliction, so then we sort of help people, and then this body will eventually finish. And when the body finishes, then if our aspiration was that to achieve nirvana, if that was our aspiration, then when this body finishes, we end up in this sort of mental state of peace. We take on the word they use is mental body, a mental body. But then we end up in this solitary state of peace, complete peace, but we have no perception of anything else in the universe. It's a complete solitary state of peace. And we stay in that state for a long, long, long time. But eventually, because it's a temporary state, because it's not the final goal, we'll pop out of that state and realise there's something more to do, and then we'll continue the journey to enlightenment. The Theravada would say when we end up in that state, that's end of story, there's nothing more.
It doesn't sound that attractive though.
In fact, the Dalai Lama has said if he thought that was the goal of the spiritual path, he wouldn't like to achieve nirvana. The Dalai Lama has said that himself. Okay. So this is the technique that was most widely taught in ancient India and Tibet, because the second technique was considered quite too difficult for the average person. But I think in our modern world, it's probably could be the more effective technique, and we'll see why in a minute. And the second technique has quite a long name. It's called equalizing and exchanging self with others. And this has 5 steps. The first step is equalizing self with others. And this is a little bit similar to the idea of equanimity. But of course here we're talking about also putting ourselves at the same level of others. Because even if we have equanimity, we see everyone equally, we may still sort of put ourselves above everyone. Everyone's equal except me, I'm sort of a bit here. And so equalizing self with others is about, again, a similar idea that we're all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. So to sort of equalise ourselves in that way, that we're all equal in that regard. And then on that basis, the second point is is to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Now here we have to be very careful with this word self-cherishing. Self-cherishing doesn't mean feeling good about ourselves, or self-confidence, or that's got nothing to do with this. Self-cherishing is just another word for the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of others. And unfortunately, the modern society seems to even promote this idea that actually, you need to look after number one. You're the most important. America first. I mean, anything first is bad news. I mean, really. I mean, even also for America, to say America first is bad news for America, forget about anyone else. Because it seems like actually superficially it could seem like that's going to give us happiness. You know, looking after me, I'm most important. But actually it's our worst enemy. It only brings suffering to ourselves and the people around us. So to reflect on some disadvantages of this, for example, if we really have this me attitude, I'm most important, then often we can become very obsessed about me and my happiness, me and my suffering. And if we become obsessed about me and my suffering, then usually with that we develop a lot of fear and anxiety about the world. Because everything out there is a potential threat to me. So I better be on guard. Even my best friend could hurt me, so I better be on guard. And so it can get very stressful. And we can become very sensitive. And this was highlighted recently in a medical study I saw that they did. It was a very extensive medical study. I think it was in North America or Europe. And the result of the medical study was that people who use the words I, me and mine a lot have a 35% greater risk of heart attack. So it seems like it could be quite stressful, this me attitude. And then, of course, to protect ourselves from all this supposed danger out there, what do? We build a big wall around ourselves to protect ourselves, so we cut ourselves off from everything else, so we have a lot of loneliness and isolation. So people who tend to be very lonely often are self-obsessed, me. And then on the flip side, if we are obsessed about me and my happiness, then often together with that we have this idea that the happiness is coming from out there. So often, and of course because of that, we often have a lot of craving and attachment for things. With that comes often a lot of frustration when we don't get them. Often a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. So this is what happens if we have this very strong me attitude in terms of happiness and suffering. And then, of course, with this same attitude, we end up with an exaggerated sense of self-importance, which often leads to a lack of consideration and respect for others. And then together with that, of course, comes a lot of jealousy when others seem to have more than us, a lot of competitiveness, trying to outdo people and put them down. And then also with that often comes a lot of being very arrogant and dismissive of others who seem to be at a lower level than ourselves. And then, of course, with this me attitude, and my happiness is the most important thing in the planet, more important than anyone else, then, of course, we'll even go to the extent of harming others who stand in the way of our happiness. And generally, if we harm others in the pursuit of our happiness, they harm us back. And also, if we harm others in the pursuit of our happiness, then at least a little bit in the corner of our mind, we understand that's not a really good thing to do. And then often we end up feeling guilty and having low self-esteem as well. And then, of course, as we already mentioned, with this me attitude, then we tend to have a very narrow perspective of every situation. Any situation we go into, our perspective is simply, how is this situation affecting me? And then, again, what we do is we divide people into these three groups simply from the perspective of how they seem to be affecting me. The people who seem to be supporting me in my happiness, friend. The ones who don't seem to be affecting me in any way, stranger. The ones who seem to be interfering with me and my happiness seem to be maybe even causing me suffering, so-called enemy. And then, of course, we end up with attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, and hatred to difficult people. And then when it comes to cultivating loving kindness and compassion, it becomes almost impossible. we wouldn't be able to develop loving kindness and compassion in a pure way to anyone. Because loving kindness and compassion to strangers, well, not really, couldn't care less what happened to them. Loving kindness and compassion to difficult people, no way. In fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer because they're trying to harm me. Loving kindness and compassion to friends, okay, but only as long as they keep saying and doing things that make me happy, otherwise no. So we won't be able to really develop loving kindness and compassion to anyone in a very authentic way with this selfish mind. So these are some of the disadvantages of the self-cherishing attitude, to reflect on that. And then together with that, we have the third point. To reflect on the advantages of cherishing others, which is basically the flip side of the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Because if we're cherishing others, we're not going to be obsessed about me and my happiness and me and my suffering. So we're not going to have all this fear and anxiety about the world. We're not going to be all stressed out about that. We're not going to build a big wall around ourselves and feel lonely and isolated.
Sorry, what means cherishing?
To care for others. And then, of course, on the flip side, we won't be obsessed about me and my happiness, so we won't have all this craving and attachment, frustration, disappointment, and so forth that comes with that. And of course, we won't have an exaggerated sense of self-importance, which means we will show consideration and respect for others. And instead of being jealous of others, we'll be happy for them. Instead of being competitive with others, we'll be helping others. And certainly, instead of being arrogant and dismissive of others who seem to be lower than us, we'll be, again, helping them as much as we can. And then, of course, we won't be deliberately harming others in the pursuit of our happiness. And we'll be able to cultivate loving kindness and compassion to everyone. But here, again, we need to be understand what cherishing others, really, to understand this in a good way. Otherwise, we get ourselves into difficulty here. And to highlight that, I'd like to give a real-life story. Some years ago, there was a man from Denmark here. He was a school teacher, and he heard about this idea of cherishing others, and he thought, great idea. I'm going to go back and cherish my school children. And he was teaching primary school. So he went back and he was trying to implement this cherishing others, cherishing the children in his class. But the result was a disaster because the children started misbehaving and playing up in class. And then he really had a dilemma because he felt like cherishing them was the right thing to do, but the result was a mess. But then after some time he realised that cherishing them wasn't so much about sitting there smiling and saying nice things, because when the children saw that, they started misbehaving. So cherishing others, of course, means caring for, helping others. So if others are misbehaving, then to help them to overcome that bad behaviour. So remember, cherishing others, we always have to add wisdom. Because otherwise, if we do this without wisdom, people will walk over the top of us. We'll be a doormat. And that's not cherishing others. In fact, that's the opposite of cherishing others, because if we allow people to take advantage of us when we try and help them, then we're encouraging them in some way to behave badly, which is the opposite of cherishing others. So we need to make sure that we always have wisdom included when we do this cherishing others. There was a question here.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you had an example of how you would implement that. Like, showing someone, like if it was like this example of school children, how would you show them that you
Well, you just show to them that behaving this way is not helpful for them or for anyone else, that it's not very helpful behaviour. Of course, we don't want to do cognitive fusion and get angry at them or something like that. So that's not going to work. But, you know, just education, really. I mean, that's all it is. So if we use the right sort of language, then we can help and educate and help people to be more ethical and behave in a better way.
When I asked, like, it was said before that before, like, helping others, you have to help yourself. So what is the border between helping yourself and being compassionate and being self-centered?
Yeah. So here, again, is like, you know, when we say, you know, there's a saying also, if you want to change the world, change your mind. But that doesn't mean that we just sit there and change our mind and do nothing in the world. It doesn't mean we just sit there and develop ourselves and don't help. Because developing ourselves is something we'll need to do for the rest of our life, you know. But what it's saying is that if we don't at least begin to do that and we just go out, we're probably going to make a big mess in the world, because we'll have all these mental afflictions and we'll just create more problems. So therefore we need a balance of those two. We need to work on improving ourselves, and while we're doing that we try and help as much as we can within the limits that we can, and then always trying to improve that so we can be better and better and more help to others. So this is a sort of a balance that we'll be needing to work on for the rest of our life. It's not like we do one and then just the other. We need to put them together. Yeah.
In the context of the same question, sometimes those people are siblings or spouses or family or parents or whatever. In that case, if you're not able to help them and they become triggers.
Triggers for you?
Yeah.
To react in a bad way?
Yeah. So then what's the recommendation on how long you should abstain? Or, I mean, obviously there can't be a quantitative recommendation.
Well, if they're always a trigger, then you need to sort of, as best you can, sort of minimise that. I mean, of course, we're not talking about running away and abandoning family or whatever. I mean, that's not okay, but certainly to try to minimise the likelihood of that, because there's no point in going in those situations where you're always reacting in a negative way. So on this question then, of course, then when we see that, then we really think, okay, I really need to work here to develop myself so that when they say or do something that triggers a negative reaction, then I'll be able to not react in a negative way, so that I'll be able to stay in that situation and then help them to overcome, maybe if they are actually saying or doing negative things, to actually help them, but at least not harm them, you know. So at least, you know, like Shantideva says, that when we're in these situations where something's triggering us and we're about to react in a negative way, he says, remain like a piece of wood. And I think someone mentioned earlier what to do in sort of situation, take 3 deep breaths, you know, because that can also help, because that delays the reaction, you know. If we just take 3 deep breaths, often that sort of trigger has sort of subsided somewhat. So then if we open our mouth, more likely we'll probably say something constructive rather than just reacting.
I have a responsibility towards my children.
I hope so.
So isn't it right that I prioritize towards their feeding them? Isn't it right that I first prioritize towards feeding my children or tending to them, then I go out of my house and serve?
Yeah. So again, when we talk about having equanimity and equal loving kindness, we're not talking about spending the same amount of time and behaving in the same way and having the same priorities, because you have responsibility to your children, so you need to make time for your children. So yes, you need to do that.
It doesn't conflict that, suppose Buddhism says the world is our family.
Sure, but you have certain, and we should look like that, but even within a family we have certain responsibilities to certain family members that require us to do more things and so forth. So that's fine, it's okay. So that's the advantages of cherishing others. And actually on that, there's a saying, there's not a saying, a verse from, again, this great Indian master Shantideva, who basically has a verse on these 2 points. He says, whatever suffering there is in the world, all comes from wanting myself to be happy. Whatever happiness there is in the world, all comes from desiring others to be happy. And what he's saying is that the suffering that we see in the world is coming from this selfish, self-centered attitude, and the happiness that we see in the world is coming from this attitude of cherishing others. So reflecting on these two would lead us to the 4th step. And that is exchanging self with others. And so what this means is that in daily life, when we see the selfish, self-centered attitude coming up, then we are to exchange that or to replace that with an attitude of cherishing others as much as we can. And there's a very nice few lines here that on this point, which says, when I am hungry, give me someone that I can feed. And when I am thirsty, give me someone who needs a drink. And when I am cold, give me someone to keep warm. And when I grieve, give me someone to console. So that was, of course, from Mother Teresa, so I think she was quite good at this exchanging self with others. And there's another line I like. It's short. It says, only a life lived for others is a life worthwhile. And that comes from Einstein, so maybe he was onto something there. But again, in this exchanging self with others, then we need to make sure that we do this with wisdom. Because often people don't, and so then they just give, but they don't look after themselves. And then, of course, they get physically and mentally run down. And then, of course, we're of no use to anyone. And so sometimes people feel like if I'm doing something for myself, I'm being selfish. No. It depends on your motivation. If you are doing something for yourself with a motivation, therefore I can be of more and better service to others, that's completely unselfish. And actually, sometimes the Dalai Lama, when he's giving a public talk, and he's talking on these sort of topics, he understands that, that many of us in the modern world are very selfish because our society is sort of programming that into us. And of course he's saying to be unselfish. But then he says, and he understands it's very difficult for us. So he says sometimes, okay, if you have to be selfish, at least be selfish in a smart way. Now we're selfish in a dumb way, and that is we harm others who stand in the way of our happiness. That's dumb selfishness, because they just harm us back. Smart selfishness is saying, okay, my happiness is a little bit dependent on the people around me, so if I help them, they're more likely to help me. So that's already one step in improvement. And actually, this can be very helpful. So of course, if we notice a selfish motivation, but we're going to do something good, then of course try to reduce that as much as possible, but still do the act. Because sometimes people who want to do something good, they notice some sort of selfish motivation, maybe they're hoping to get something back, and they go, I'm not going to do that, I'm being selfish. I think this wouldn't be a good strategy. Because for us now, to do a completely unselfish act would be almost impossible. Because at least we would expect them to say thank you. Rather, as the Dalai Lama recommends, we need to be practical about this. And that's the essence here, is that, of course, try to reduce the selfish motivation as much as possible. And try to really do the action just for helping others. But even if there's still some residual selfishness, then still do the good act. Because otherwise we won't do any good acts. Because we have some selfishness at some level now. And then the more we do that, what you will find is, over time, the joy you get from merely helping them versus the joy of hoping to get something in return will far outweigh it. And you'll find that over time, that level of selfishness will reduce. So that's a sort of practical way. Whereas if we demand that from the very beginning to be completely unselfish, I think you're going to find it very difficult. Because using the word ego is very strong. And so the ego, of course, is selfish. And if we try to hit the ego head on, it's going to be tough. Because the ego is going to say, I'm not going to do that because I'm not getting anything out of it. Whereas if there is a bit of this smart selfishness, then it's a bit ego-friendly, you know. Oh, I'm going to get something out of it? Okay, we can do that. We can do that. And so you're being a bit ego-friendly. It's because it'll be easier. But of course, all the while, what we're doing is we're pretending to be the friend of the ego, while all the while we're undercutting it, sort of sneaking up from behind. Because if you hit it head on, it's going to be difficult. Whereas if you sort of say, well, I'm going to get something out of it. Okay, that's okay. And then it's easier to do. So we keep doing that, but all the while we're slowly cutting, and then we can be eventually completely unselfish. So this would be what's called smart selfishness, where we're sort of using selfishness against itself. So that's exchanging self with others. And then the fifth and last point is a meditation practice called Tong-len. Tong-len is a Tibetan word, and it literally means giving and taking. And what we're doing in this practice is that we are imagining taking on the sufferings of others and imagining giving our happiness away to them. And this is a very powerful practice that really is very powerful in reducing and eliminating the self-cherishing mind. Because the last thing the self-cherishing mind would want to do would be to take on any suffering from anyone, and the last thing the self-cherishing mind would want to do would be to give away any happiness to anyone. And so by imagining doing that, we're really weakening that self-cherishing mind and increasing the mind of cherishing others. And to put it another way, at the same time, we are really transforming our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. And this practice, like loving kindness and compassion, we do in stages. So generally, again, in the text, 4 stages are mentioned. First, you do this with friends. Once you're comfortable there, extend out to people you don't know very well, you're comfortable there. Start to expand out to difficult people, and then eventually to all living beings. But again, I think in our modern society we need to add one more step at the very beginning, and that is to first do this Tong-len practice toward ourselves, to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves first. Then we can expand out to others. Now in this practice, we do this usually conjoining with the breath. So usually with the compassion, we do that on the in-breath. Imagine taking suffering on the in-breath, and on the out-breath, giving happiness. And that reason we do it with the breath is just so we can better, it's easier to stay focused. And the visualization for this is that the traditional way that it's done is that when we do the first part of the practice, which is the compassion part, the taking suffering, is we imagine, let's say we have imagine this person in front of us, and we imagine they're suffering usually in some sort of form of black smoke or darkness or something in their body. And then using the in-breath, we imagine drawing that out of them. And then usually when we're learning it, we do that over a number of breaths, and we're drawing more and more out, and then it sort of collects in a little cloud in front of us. And then the next step is we imagine our selfish, self-cherishing mind as a small black rock in the center of our chest. And then we breathe in that smoke or darkness, or however we visualize the suffering. Imagine it comes in, goes down, touches the black rock of selfishness, and they're both completely destroyed. The symbolism here, of course, is it's our willingness to take suffering that destroys the selfish mind. So that's the symbolism. Personally, I prefer to use a slightly different visualization because two reasons. One is, again, we have this obsessive focus on the negative in the modern world. And then often people do this cognitive fusion. So when they visualize this, they identify with it, or the black smoke, they identify with it, and they just take it and hold on to it and punish themselves with that suffering or something. So what I prefer to do, and maybe Felipe does this as well, is that instead of visualizing the black rock of selfish mind, is to visualize a white light, which is symbolizing the inner purity of our mind. That, and we'll see this a little bit more tomorrow, that no matter how much mental afflictions we've got in our mind, they're not part of the nature of our mind. Of course, there are many modern philosophies that say exactly that the basic human nature is greed, it's anger, it's jealousy, it's craving, and that's it. And you better get used to it, you know. You're stuck with it. Whereas Buddhism would disagree with that, is that no matter how much craving, attachment, jealousy, anger and so forth we have, is not part of the nature of our mind. It's just like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And that beneath this dirt of the mental afflictions is the inner purity of our mind. So we can visualize that in the center of our chest as a small white light, this inner purity of our mind. Another way of saying that is that's our inner wisdom. And so then when we do this visualization, we imagine taking that black smoke in and it's completely dissolved in that light. And the symbolism there is it's our wisdom that dissolves mental afflictions and suffering. So both of those we can do on the compassion side. So we do usually start with that, and we do that for some time, and then we imagine that's, if we're doing it with someone, that eventually then that is completely extinguished, now they're free of suffering. And then the second half then is we then have this wish for them to be happy, so that's loving kindness. So the first was the compassion. Then the second half, the loving kindness. So again, we have that light in the center of our chest, symbolizing the inner purity and happiness. And then we send out the light to them using the out breath, sending out that, and then sending them happiness, and allowing that light to transform into whatever they need to be happy, short term and long term. And we do that for some time, and then we see now they've achieved that genuine happiness, and then to rejoice in that. So this is the Tong-len practice. Now, a couple of more points about that, of course, is that the key in this practice is not whether or not we have nice-looking smoke and nice-looking light. the key is wanting to take the suffering and wanting to give happiness. That's the key. Whether or not the visualization is clear or not. I mean, you could have super clear visualization, but then it's just a smoke and light show. It doesn't mean anything. The key is, whether or not we have good visualization or not, is wanting to take the suffering and wanting to give happiness. That's the key. And of course, what will probably happen, as with the compassion practice, is when we get to the point of doing this practice for a difficult person, there'll be some resistance. Even to the point where you think, well, they don't really deserve it because they're a bad person. So again, that's cognitive fusion. So avoid the cognitive fusion. And one thing that can help when we're doing it with difficult people is that we can understand that they're just like us. They want to be happy, want to be free of suffering. But their mind, they are dominated by their mental afflictions of anger, jealousy, hatred, whatever. And that's what's driving them to behave in this very negative way. And so what we would want, of course, is that the goal we want is for them to stop that negative behaviour. So actually, we would want them to be free of that mental affliction. So when you're doing this practice for the difficult people, visualise whatever their mental affliction is in the form of smoke and take that from them. And I think you'll find it a little bit easier. And of course, it's more directly relevant for that person. Now, when this practice is explained, some doubts come up. One is that, if I'm doing it for someone who's got some serious illness, will I get their illness? And of course the answer is no. This is a mental exercise. You can't actually take anyone's physical illness or physical problem. But then, if we can't actually take anyone's suffering, what's the point of this exercise, is the next doubt or question. The whole point of this exercise, this Tong-len practice, is for us to reduce our selfish mind, increase the mind of cherishing others, for us to reduce our attachment and aversion, and to increase loving kindness and compassion. So we are the main beneficiary of this practice, which means if we do this practice well, it means that when we go out in daily life, we're more likely to help people in a more authentic way. Because even now when we help people, often it's with a bit of a selfish motivation. I know what's best for you. You need to do like I tell you. And so we're more thinking about me than them. Whereas if we do this practice, we can let go of that more, and we can be more authentic in the way we help people, and then we'll start to help people who now we simply ignore. We thought, well, that's their problem, I don't care about them. But also, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the mind. Meaning that if we do this practice, and particularly if we're doing this practice in a very authentic, heartfelt way, with someone who we have a connection with, then it is possible at a subtle level to have a direct positive impact on that person's mind. And I think there is some scientific evidence to support that, even if they're on the other side of the planet. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of the mind. Now, one other thing with this practice is that it's best to do this anonymously. Because if we do this practice for someone and we tell them we're doing it for them, it could become a bit of an ego trip. You realise I'm doing this for you? You better appreciate this. And also, and I find this very unfortunate, I was told that they did a study about people praying for other people who are ill, and the study showed that if we tell people, I find very tragic, but apparently it's true, that if we tell people that we're praying for them, in general, there's a slight negative impact on that person. And I think maybe it's because I don't know, he didn't say why, but that's what studies show. Maybe it's because people sort of think they're under pressure then to do something, or they don't want people praying for them, or whatever reason. But apparently, on average, if you tell people you're praying for them, then often it has a very slight negative impact. And also from this perspective here, it's much better to do it anonymously, because otherwise we could, a bit of an ego trip, I'm doing this for you. You realise that. You better be appreciative of that. I think it's more helpful to do it anonymously. And then there's less likely it'll be a bit of an ego trip.
I guess the effect depends on the level of trust. The trust into the person and the trust of the prayer.
Yeah, sure. And it's right. I'm not saying everyone has a negative impact, but what this study showed was over a big group of people, the average effect was slightly negative on the person if you told them you were praying for them. So best to pray for them without telling them. But of course, if you have a very close connection and you understand that if you say that will help them, then of course we would tell them. But if it's a stranger, maybe we don't say anything, because they may have that effect on them.
When you're taking on the pain of someone else, or the suffering of someone else, what are you doing with it? So say
Well, again, you either, with the visualization, either you are destroying the selfish mind with it, or you're dissolving it into your inner wisdom. What you don't want to do is hold on to it, because that's cognitive fusion, so that's not this practice.
Because when someone's say it's someone really close to you and they're really ill or something, how do you detach from that?
Detach from...
the feelings for them. So, or you're extra sympathetic towards them because they're close to you.
Yeah, so, in fact, empathy is the basis for compassion. So if they're close to you, we should be able to do this in a much more heartfelt way.
But you sometimes carry it a little longer, do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah. So again, with this practice, we do it in stages. So even though we start with friends, we wouldn't start with the friend with the biggest problem, because it'll overwhelm us, because we don't have that capacity. So we start with friends with small problems and then move up from there. And what you'll find is actually that when we're faced with some big suffering like that, the reason we suffer is because of selfishness. Because I don't like to see that. It's affecting me in a bad way. So if you do this practice, what you'll find is that when you then encounter those more difficult, particularly close people, you'll find that won't be there, because you've already cut the selfish mind through this practice. And you'll find that's why we do it in stages. When we get to that point, we can be fully present for them, full empathy, full compassion, and not feel overwhelmed. Because the reason we feel overwhelmed is not their suffering, it's our selfish mind that overwhelms us. Because our selfish mind doesn't like suffering.
So in this practice, we in-breath suffering and we out-breath happiness.
Correct.
Right? So basically it's quite the opposite of what we do in many other practices. So in many other meditations, where you inhale happiness and you exhale suffering. Basically, right? Not all of them.
Yeah, but
many of them.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you say to your body, no, don't worry, this is for good? You know what I mean?
Well, remember, I'm not holding on to the suffering.
Yeah, but it's like you are doing exactly the opposite of...
Correct.
So
because in the other practice, like in purification, see, the purification is we're purifying. And to symbolize that, we imagine black stuff going out of the body as a symbol of purification. Whereas here, we are... what we're doing is we are doing this to develop compassion. This willingness to take the suffering.
Right.
So it's sort of counterintuitive, but this is really the strong medicine. But again, we're not sort of taking that to punish ourselves or something. So this is cognitive fusion.
Okay.
So that's why I prefer the white light, the purity of the mind, the inner wisdom. Because that's what's going to dissolve suffering and mental afflictions. So you take that suffering and dissolve it into your inner wisdom. In that sense.
Okay.
when you talk about like doing this practice with difficult people, what about difficult people that maybe haven't directly harmed you? For example, your partner looks at another person and is jealous of them, but they haven't actually done anything, but you just don't like them, you know?
Well, again, to not do cognitive fusion, and then they're like everyone else. They just want to be happy and want to be free of suffering, and then take their suffering, and if you see that they have certain mental afflictions, and everyone has mental afflictions, take them as well.
Just in general,
I mean, again, we just do it in stages, and then you'll find it becomes a lot easier for difficult people. And this practice, of course, is a meditation practice, but this is a practice that we can do all day long. And when you do this practice, and I think you'll be doing this with Felipe tomorrow morning, is that often we start by doing, we do sort of a number of in-breaths, take the suffering with compassion, and a number of out-breaths like this. But once we learn to practice in daily life, we can do the whole practice in one breath. So any time in daily life we see someone who's obviously suffering physically or mentally, on the in-breath, take the suffering, on the out-breath, bring them happiness. So we can do this all day long, all day long. Of course, this is not a substitute for helping people. Because you could be walking around doing this and going, oh, I'm so compassionate. But then, of course, if you have an opportunity to help someone and you don't, then you're just fooling yourself. It's just a game. If you're doing this really in a proper way in daily life, and you have the opportunity to help, you should notice you're helping people more than you do. So that's sort of the check, whether it's just a sort of a game, or whether you're really wanting to take something and give them happiness. And also here, as we talked about earlier in terms of short-term strategy, we can use the same thing if we're suffering. If we're suffering, that, again, we use the example of the migraine headache. If we're having a migraine headache, take the migraine headache of everyone else on the planet, give them happiness. If we have anger coming up in our mind, take the anger of everyone else, give them happiness. Whatever suffering, physical or mental, take theirs on, give them happiness. And that's also very much an antidote for us getting caught up in our own suffering, because we're focusing on others and not ourselves. So that's going to be very, very helpful in daily life. So that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of this technique. We've still got a couple of minutes left if there's any last questions. Yeah. What went behind first?
It's okay. You kind of touched on my question, but just to summarize that, the difference between the Tong-len practice and the purification practice.
Right.
What exactly is the difference?
Yeah. So in Tong-len, we are cultivating loving kindness and compassion. And in purification, we're purifying our mind of negativities. So that's the difference.
And the visualization difference?
Well, again, with this Tong-len, we don't even have to do any visualization. If you find, visualization can make, and the breath can make it more focused, and often people find visualization quite powerful. But if you find the visualization, you're not good at it, and you find it doesn't really help, don't do it. Just want to take the suffering and want to give them happiness. That's the key.
Difference between bodhicitta and bodhisattva?
So someone who's cultivated bodhicitta is called a bodhisattva. So bodhicitta is the aspiration for enlightenment, and when we develop that really fully, then we're a bodhisattva. We're called a bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva is someone who has bodhicitta.
I was trying to think about practical ways of putting this in.
Sure.
And with number one, it's very abstract to me, through meditation.
Well, in meditation, but also daily life. If we feel ourselves superior to others somehow, that we're more important, then put yourself in their shoes. Put yourself in their shoes, and you can quickly see they're just like you, wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. We're all equal.
But that would be similar to step 4.
Well, step one. That's step one. Step 4 is if we're going to do something and we notice a selfish motivation, then we change that with the motivation as much as possible of cherishing others, of wishing to help others.
in an event where you inadvertently end up with a close one, with a close member of your family, who gets a debilitating disease,
right,
and you're taking care of them, and you obviously land up in the position of taking care of them,
right.
How do you avoid the sort of caregiver syndrome? The caregiver syndrome of like you want to help them, and obviously you do helping them, but not becoming resentful of it because like someone with Alzheimer's per se or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
So again, we need to have wisdom. We need to have wisdom there to make sure that we're looking after ourselves and not overextending our level of capacity. Because if we really want to care for them, we really need to take care of ourselves. And if it's a very difficult situation and we're getting overwhelmed, then we need to do something about that, because that's not good for you and it's not good for the other person if we get overwhelmed, because then we'll get resentful and then the whole thing will collapse. So we need, if that's the case, then wisdom might say, okay, I need another carer, I need someone to help me a couple of days a week to take the load off from me. I mean, we need to do this, otherwise we'll get resentful and then we'll give up, and then that's not good for anyone. So we need to know what our boundaries, our limits are in terms of our ability to help, what our capacity is. And then, of course, all the while we can be trying to improve our capacity through all of these sorts of practices, but not to overextend the level of capacity, because otherwise this will happen. This will happen.
In number 2, when you said that putting a wall around ourselves is selfish, isn't it sometimes necessary to protect ourselves?
Yeah, but we don't build a wall. We just, again, know we use our wisdom and compassion to not allow people to, infringe on us. So that's different from building a wall. So in that situation, we're still close to everyone, and we're not sort of hiding behind a wall. But if someone is starting to be trying to take advantage of us, we need to be very firm about that. So we're still very connected to that person, but we're using wisdom to not allow that to happen. So we're not cutting them off, which is what the wall is. We're cutting off everybody. So that's not healthy for us or anyone else.
Can you explain point 4 again?
So point 4, exchanging self with others, is again based on 2 and 3. I mean, if we haven't done 2 or 3, we won't be able to do 4, because we'll think being selfish is good. So we need to reflect on the fact that being selfish is just causes suffering, and cherishing others gives happiness. Then we'll have a desire, an aspiration to do 4, which means in daily life, whenever we notice a selfish motivation, then as much as possible we try to replace or exchange that with a motivation of cherishing others. And as best we can, and then even if there's and of course we're talking about doing good behaviour here, that even if there is still a bit of residual selfishness, even after we've done that, we still do the good action, because otherwise we won't really do anything good, because there probably at our beginning level, there probably will be some level of selfishness. We try to reduce it as much as possible, but still then we do the good action. So step 4 is about shifting our motivation when we do things for others as much as possible. Your last question, then we need to finish.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're sort of out of vision. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question is, how many people can we work on visualization, meditation? How many people can I bring? Or
Well, again, you start with 1, and then you can do 2, and then you can do a group, and then you can do hundreds of people. But again, we need to do it in a step-by-step way. Otherwise, we'll get overwhelmed. I mean, you can do it to a whole country, the whole world if you want. But we have to develop that capacity. So step by step. So it's not just one at a time, but that's where we start. Very last question, we need to stop.
Tong-len meditation is just step, or when we do this meditation, all 4 steps are also covered?
So these steps are what's going to help us to be able to better do this. But it's not like we have to do that first and then we do that later. But if we don't do these things, then this is going to be more difficult, step 4 and 5. But we can start doing Tong-len right at the beginning, but it's good to, of course, put some effort into these steps as well. Okay, we've run over time there again, so let's stop there. So tomorrow we're going to be looking at the wisdom side of the practice, the Vipassana. So in your booklet, we're going to cover this correct view of emptiness on page 13 and page 14. So halfway down on 14. Page 13, part 14. And if we get time tomorrow afternoon, we may also look on page 15, this 5 paths presentation. But certainly page 13 and 14. And we'll also look at a little bit this idea of no self first in the morning. So now at 5:30 with Felipe, you'll be doing, again, starting with that shamatha, observing the mind. And then you'll be doing a death awareness meditation to really become more familiar with the death. And then this evening, the shamatha practice of resting in awareness with equanimity practice to develop equanimity. And then tomorrow morning, again, before breakfast, again, another shamatha practice of this resting in awareness. And the second half of that will be the Tong-len practice that we just described here. So that's it. So take a break, come back 5:30, and I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.